Consumers want to know the facts about the products they buy, but America's agricultural landscape is not easy to navigate. Between different companies, scientific advancement, government regulations, advertisement campaigns, and an unhealthy amount of myth and misconception, anyone would be hard-pressed to make sense of it. That's where Real Ag comes in. From the producers who make your food, to the store where you buy the final product, and everything in between. This is Real Ag. Now, here's your host, Kyle Bauer.
There are several different types of weeds in Kansas, but what really is a weed and how do you protect other species of plants from it? We'll be exploring these questions and more as we talk to a professor at Kansas State's Department of Agronomy, as well as the Kansas Department of Agriculture's Plant Protection and Weed Control Manager. Join us as we explore more about noxious weeds and plant protection on this episode of Real Ag.
Production of Real Ag is made possible in part by an underwriting grant from
the Kansas Soybean Commission, the Soybean Checkoff, progress powered by farmers.
What classifies as a weed?
There are a number of different definitions for weeds. The ecologists define a weed as a plant that invades disturbed sites and has different ecological characteristics that make him weedy, so to speak. There was a philosopher who once said that a weed was a plant whose virtues have yet to be discovered. And so that's another common definition that's used. Another one that we oftentimes hear frequently is a plant out of place. But the most practical definition to me is simply a plant growing where it's not wanted. Because again, whether you're talking about an agricultural field, somebody's lawn, or a garden, if you don't want it there, then it can become a weed. There are some crops that can be weeds, for example. Volunteer corn can be a serious problem in soybeans, and likewise volunteer wheat is one of our most serious weeds that we have in fallow.
What are major weeds we have in Kansas?
Well, obviously we have quite a variety of different species of weeds in Kansas that can be a problem, but three that I would probably rank near the top would be Palmer amaranth, which is a pigweed species. Palmer amaranth is very aggressive and very competitive with our crops, and it now has developed resistance to 6 different classes of herbicides, and so that also makes it very difficult to control. So to me, Palmer amaranth is probably our worst weed statewide. Another related species is common water hemp, which is more common in the eastern half of the state, and it has many of the same characteristics that Palmer amaranth has. Again, a very competitive weed, developed resistance to a number of different herbicides, and so again, very difficult to control and very troublesome, especially in our summer row crops. The third weed that I would categorize as one of our most problematic weeds is kochia. Now, kochia is most common in the western half of the state, but it's a problem for many of the same reasons. Again, it has developed resistance to many of our different classes of herbicides, and especially glyphosate with all 3 of these. And again, that's part of the reason they become so difficult to manage.
What does it mean when a weed is referred to as herbicide resistant?
Herbicide resistance might be confused with tolerance, but in the weed science world at least, we define tolerance as the natural tolerance to herbicides. And so when we introduce a new herbicide, that weed never was controlled. Resistance, however, we define as a weed or a species of weed that develops resistance through time due to repeated exposure to that herbicide. So over time, with the repeated applications of the herbicide, we're selecting for those individuals in the population that are not controlled. And eventually we shift that population from one that initially was susceptible to one that we no longer can control, and therefore we call it resistant.
Can herbicide resistance be prevented?
The only way to truly prevent herbicide resistance is simply not to use any herbicides, because as soon as we start using a herbicide, we start that selection process. Now, how quickly that process occurs will depend a lot upon the selection pressure that we place on that population. So, repeated applications of the same herbicide or herbicides that work the same way over time, and especially in the absence of the use of other herbicides or other methods of weed control, will increase that selection pressure and result in more rapid development of herbicide resistance.
Is not using herbicides organic farming?
Well, certainly that would be organic farming, and I'm not necessarily advocating that we not use herbicides. All I'm saying is that once we start to use a herbicide, we will start that process of selecting for herbicide resistance. Again, it can take many years in many cases, but it will depend upon what else we're doing to manage those weeds through time.
What other methods are used to control weeds?
Well, what we would suggest to try to prevent the development of herbicide resistance is to use an integrated weed management approach. And so that would mean incorporating as many different methods of weed control and different classes of herbicides into your weed control program. So incorporating cultural practices such as crop rotation, the use of cover crops, using good agronomic practices that promote the competitiveness of the crop versus the weed. Those would be good practices from a cultural standpoint. Mechanical control also is another method of control that we can utilize, and that would include tillage and maybe even hand weeding. Now, the no-till folks, obviously, they don't want to utilize tillage, so if we're doing that, we are eliminating one method of weed control and we are putting more selection pressure on the other methods of control. Biological control, that would be the utilization of other organisms to help suppress those weeds, things like diseases and insects, maybe even goats grazing Serratia lespedeza, for example. That would be a method of biological weed control. That's something that we don't utilize specifically in cropland very often. But again, we want to utilize the different methods of control. And with our herbicide programs, we don't want to rely just on one herbicide or class of herbicides. We want to utilize different classes of herbicides in sequence over time so that we're not putting as much selection pressure on for resistance to that one herbicide.
Are there laws or regulations in weed control?
Well, not too much, to be honest with you. One law that we have in the state of Kansas that does deal with weed control is the Noxious weed law, but that law applies only to those weeds that have been declared as noxious weeds. And so there are only about a dozen of those weeds, and in that case, you are required by law to control those weeds if they are present on your land or land that you manage. Other than that, there really are no programs per se that necessarily say, that you have to control your weeds.
What are the differences between a weed and noxious weeds?
Well, a noxious weed is one that is declared legally to be noxious, and the way that we have done that over time is that it's taken legislative action to do that. Now in Kansas, the noxious weed law may be changing here in the near future, and so the declaration of whether those weeds are noxious or not will perhaps change in how that is done. But again, currently at least, it's through legislative action.
Well, noxious weed, from our perspective, is a legal definition, or it's a legal term, and it's actually, if it's noxious in the state right now, it's because it's listed as noxious. And because when it's declared, a weed is declared noxious, it requires the landowner, whether public or private, to control that noxious weed species, meaning either stopping the spread, eradicating it, or containing it. Beyond that, I guess noxious weeds are not allowed in seed mixtures, feed, soil, etc., to be moved in the state. A lot of the work with the noxious weed law is done at the county level. County weed directors are very important personnel in implementing the act and working with landowners and making sure that noxious weeds are controlled in the county and not becoming a nuisance or a bother to adjoining landowners.
Are you seeing variations on different types of weeds than we are seeing just 5 years ago?
Well, we definitely see big shifts in weed species through time, and a lot of that is in relationship to our production practices and maybe also the herbicides that we utilize. For example, as we shifted from conventional till to no-till, we did see a shift to more winter annual weeds, things like mare's tail and henbit, because typically in our summer crops we were tilling that ground maybe even in the fall, but definitely early in the spring, killing any winter annual weeds that are out there prior to the time that we planted our summer annual crop. But in no-till, especially in the early years of no-till, we thought, well, we can just wait until planting time, go out there and kill all those weeds at that point in time, and then move forward. Well, if we do that, a lot of those winter annual weeds were already going to seed. And so we do see a shift in weeds through time based upon, again, our production practices and the use of herbicides. That's kind of why we select for resistant weeds, herbicide-resistant weeds, is, again, we rely on one herbicide. Mother Nature does adapt.
How are weed management practices changing?
Well, certainly in the past 20 years, we saw a big increase in the use of glyphosate herbicide, especially with the introduction of Roundup-ready crops. And glyphosate's been an amazing herbicide as far as the kind of weed control that we can get. It's very broad spectrum in nature. It was very effective even on larger weeds through time. And so when we developed Roundup-ready crops, we could selectively use glyphosate in those crops, pretty much control all of our weeds, even when they got a little bit bigger. We didn't have to worry about herbicide carryover, and so it had a lot of benefits. And especially when the use patent expired and it became inexpensive. And so of course everybody shifted to glyphosate for weed control at the expense of other practices and other herbicides. That's why we have so much glyphosate-resistant weed issues at this point in time.
Do you see anything changing in the next few years for producers?
Well, through time, of course, we've had new herbicides introduced, and herbicides with different sites of action, and that's what we would like. But unfortunately, we haven't seen a new herbicide site of action introduced for quite a number of years, and again, that puts more pressure on the herbicides that we already have. So companies are looking to evaluate and discover new herbicide sites of action, but since they haven't developed any for several years, the other direction they've taken is to develop herbicide-resistant crops. So we talked about Roundup Ready, but there are other herbicide-resistant traits that are being developed and have been introduced as well, which allows us to use, again, different herbicide sites of action in different crops. For example, this last year, we saw the full commercialization of the Extend cropping system in soybeans and cotton. That allowed us to use dicamba herbicide on those crops, whereas we could have never used them previously because normally they were very susceptible to dicamba. So that's been more of a recent approach to try to give us new tools to help manage weeds through our different cropping systems.
Are producers required to report noxious weeds?
No, they're not required to report those, but they are required to control them if they have them on their land. So again, it's not a self-reporting sort of thing, but if a neighbor, for example, reports that they have noxious weeds growing on their land, or the noxious weed director drives by and notices that they have noxious weeds on their land, then the noxious weed director will contact them and inform them that they need to control those weeds.
What does the KDA Plant Protection and Weed Control Program do?
Yeah, the Plant Protection and Weed Control Program with the Department of Ag has a diverse set of responsibilities. First thing that we're kind of in charge is safeguarding, that referring to protecting the state through different rules and regulations against the introduction of exotic plant pests, including insects, plant diseases, and weeds. And so with that, we work with the live plant industry. We work in fact with a lot of the agricultural industry to implement mitigation steps to help safeguard the state from the introduction of some exotic species. In addition to that, we do a lot of export certification, meaning that we inspect commodities for export, whether it's interstate or out of the country. We do certification activities, kind of pre-clearing those agricultural commodities for entrance into those other states or other countries. In addition to that, we spend a lot of time administrating the noxious weed law, the Kansas noxious weed law, working with counties to help implement that act, and working with them to make sure they have the most up-to-date management strategies for noxious weeds.
Does a producer have to report if they have noxious weeds on their property?
Well, every year a noxious weed director, either through a general notice or letters or face-to-face conversations, is supposed to give notice to each landowner if they have noxious weeds on their property, and it's their requirement for them to control those weeds. And the weed directors do a lot of public outreach or education at that point, giving them best recommendations on how to do that. But every year that notification system is set up, but it is ultimately the landowner's responsibility to take care of that.
The noxious weed bill is going to change, and how is that going to affect things?
Sure. House Bill 2583 was just passed in the legislature and is passed to the governor currently as we're speaking, waiting for his signature. That does, I guess that is the biggest change in noxious weed policy in the last couple of decades. One of the biggest changes with it is in fact we're switching to using a noxious weed advisory committee that recommends weeds to the secretary to declare them as noxious through rules and regulations instead of through the statutory process with the legislature. The big deal with that is that we're able now, or will be able to, use a more risk-based science approach to determine which weed should be noxious or should not be noxious for that matter, so that we are more preventative in the control of our noxious weeds, getting ahead of them before they become statewide issues, rather than reactive when weeds have been declared noxious. More recently, Sericea lespedeza, there was well over 300,000 acres of Sericea lespedeza infested in the state when it was declared noxious around 2000. So the idea is that we are anticipating which weeds might become more of a nuisance or a problem in the future, using a risk-based approach with a risk assessment and then a recommendation from experts on a noxious weed advisory committee to make those determinations.
Did no-till farming increase the speed of noxious weeds or incorporate more species of noxious weeds?
Well, you know, it's an interesting you bring that up. And a lot of times our noxious weeds that are, at least recently, have been declared noxious are more perennial invasive species that invade our native areas. And a lot of our agricultural production practices, whether it's tillage or no-till or traditional herbicides you use in agricultural settings, are able to control these noxious weeds effectively. And people are able to manage them. What gets a lot of times is the situation is in a rangeland situation when you have an invasive species invade and crowd out native grasses. That I guess in that category, that's where a number of our noxious weeds currently are I guess live and exist.
What is weed forage and why is it important?
A Wheatfree forage, that is a certification program that we're part of. It is a regional program that there's a national standard of Wheatfree forage certification. The idea is that if we inspect a field and it passes and we certify that hay as weed-free forage, that sticker that we provide or the tag we provide will be accepted in other parts of the country, including national parks and national forests. In some cases, you're required to have certified weed-free forage if you're hauling your horses up into a national park, and you're supposed to provide that documentation. We can provide those services here in Kansas of inspecting that forage and providing those documents if it does pass. The other parts of it too is KDOT. If you're selling hay to KDOT for mulch, they're required to have certified weed-free forage used on their right-of-ways. And actually, in addition to the changes with our noxious weed law, one additional requirement is that all state grounds now will now require the use of weed-free forage on them, whether it's KDOT or if you're bringing hay into a state campground, for example.
Are weeds regulated as far as for planting for producers?
Sure, there's a Kansas seed law, and that is another program that the Plant Protection and Weed Control Program administrates. That is basically a truth in labeling law. We do inspections at the wholesale and retail level, making sure those labels are accurate and are composed of the right components that are required by law. In addition, we take seed samples and run those through a standardized test to make sure what is in the bag matches what is on the label. That way it ensures the consumer is getting what they paid for.
What does KDA do to protect producers from plant disease?
Sure, we enact one of our biggest authorities, or one of our biggest responsibilities is to protect the state, safeguard the state from the introduction of plant diseases. One of the tools we use is authority that the Secretary has to quarantine a plant disease. One in particular that we have in place is thousand cankers disease of walnut quarantine. Now that disease is not known to exist in the state, but is known to exist in Colorado and other states in the United States. And so we have quarantined that disease and the pathways, including movements of walnut wood from those states into Kansas, regulated that movement to help protect our resource, our walnut resource.
Are there other government agencies that the KDA partners with when controlling noxious weeds?
Very much so. Kansas State University is a big partner in this process of not only determining what weeds might need to be declared noxious or our next noxious weeds, but also the management of them. And so I say more recent, but it still was about 20 years ago when Sericea lespedeza was declared noxious. There was a lot of research in place at K-State trying to determine the best management practices. What are our effective herbicides that would be available to control it? And so they're very much a partner in this, and some of the other universities in the state. Now, the county weed directors and the counties are very much a partner in this process for noxious weed control. But certainly we rely on our friends at the university to help.
Where are we exporting that such things as weeds and seeds are checked?
Sure, when we think about our exports, we issue international phytosanitary certificates. It's a program that we do on behalf of USDA to do that. A lot of our corn or DDG products are going to Southeast Asia. Indonesia, Philippines, Vietnam, China. A lot of shipments or certificates are requested for destinations in that area. That's not to mean that there isn't exports going into any other locations, but a lot of the certificates that we requested are destined for those countries.
Do we see imports also, and how are those checked?
Sure, the imports are actually part of the USDA, Customs and Border Protection, the joint venture. So we do not have authority or responsibility over international imports into the state. With that being said, when we think of live plants, interstate movement of live plants, what you're buying and selling at, or not buying, what you're buying at Walmart or other big box stores, similar places, a lot of those plants are imported in the state, and we do inspections at those stores, making sure those plants meet our state standards.
What can people do to stop the spread of plant diseases?
Sure, so a lot of our forest health problems, whether it's thousand cankers disease of walnut, emerald ash borer, which is actually an insect that affects our ash trees and is present in the state. What we're really concerned about is the pathways, the movement of the insect inside the wood. So one of the biggest things we focus on and key on is buying local firewood and not moving untreated firewood long distances greater than a county or so. The reason there is if it's untreated firewood, if you had a tree that had died because of maybe some insect or disease problem, the first thing you do, you cut it down, and you want to use it for firewood, but if you move that firewood and as a hitchhiker, whether it's a disease or an insect, you can easily artificially spread that problem into a new area. And so if people are using local firewood, that helps protect your area from the introduction of some of our forest health.
Are there fines for transporting diseased plants?
Not particularly. When we refer to quarantine authority, if there was a violation a large violation, that would be potentially an enforcement remedy, but not like getting a citation for speeding or something of that nature.
Are there differences in the weed laws between states?
Yes, there are some differences between states' regulations when we think of interstate movement of plants, for example, but the states share that information, and we certainly work with our neighbors to the north, south, east, and west in making sure we are coordinating that information. We're part of an association, a National Plant Board, and we share our states' regulations with each other, so that if one particular state has a client wanting to ship into Kansas, we will share that information and what those requirements are ahead of time with them. So there is a lot of partnership and cooperation there.
The Kansas Department of Plant Protection and Weed Control, as well as Kansas State University, take on a large responsibility in protecting the state's agriculture from noxious weeds and plant pests. We hope that the next time you're gardening, you'll take the time to consider the weeds or plants out of place that could be taking over your yard and see to their control or removal. As always, if you want to check out this and more episodes of Real Ag, go to smokyhillstv.org. For the Real Ag crew, I'm Kyle Bauer, and this has been Real Ag.
Production of Real Ag is made possible in part by an underwriting grant from
the Kansas Soybean Commission, the Soybean Checkoff, progress powered by farmers.